Hello, Terry Lynch here, medical doctor, accredited psychotherapist, best-selling mental health author, creator of mental health courses for mental health professionals and the general public. This video is particularly for people who work in the field of mental health, particularly for therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors. But it might be of interest to anyone for whom the area of mental health is important. I'm talking today about something that most people would probably assume there's no need to talk about, and that is the validity of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, globally recognised as the reference guide for psychiatrists and GPs, mental health professionals, in relation to the diagnosis of what are described as mental disorders. This is an image of the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, published in 2013. There has in the interim been a slight revision of this edition. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, is accepted widely as the authoritative diagnostic guide to mental disorders. It is the guide within which depression criteria are set out since the 1980 DSM-3. This also applies to the vast majority of psychiatric diagnoses. The Psych Central website on the DSM. The DSM is widely known as the Bible of Psychiatry and Psychology. The Bible. That's how highly the DSM is rated internationally. From the American Psychiatric Association, the association which creates and basically owns the DSM. What is the DSM and why is it important? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is the handbook used by healthcare professionals in the United States and much of the world as the authoritative guide to the diagnosis of mental disorders. This is an accurate representation of the exalted position of the DSM worldwide. How does a psychiatrist typically diagnose? Most psychiatrists use the DSM 5th edition to diagnose the problem. From the DSM, the doctor or the therapist in many countries finds out the right criteria that fit the patient's condition. A surprising truth about this Bible, this authoritative guide, this internationally accepted diagnostic reference manual, is that the DSM has no validity. Dr. Thomas Insel has been a highly prominent psychiatrist internationally over the past several decades. He was director of the American National Institute of Mental Health, widely recognized as the most important and powerful mental health institute in the world, from 2002 to 2015. At an American Psychiatric Association meeting in 2005, at which time he was director of the National Institute of Mental Health, he said that the DSM has 100% reliability and 0% validity. I will explain what's meant by reliability a little later in this video. So here we have one of the most powerful and influential psychiatrists in the world saying that the DSM has 0% validity. Gary Greenberg is an American psychotherapist and author of many books, including this book, The Book of Woe, the DSM and the Unmaking of Psychiatry. In his book, he wrote about an interview that he carried out with the aforementioned Dr. Thomas Insel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, from 2002 to 2015. In this book, Gary Greenberg wrote, he, Thomas Insel, and his colleagues, then quoting Thomas Insel directly, had spent so much time diagnosing mental disorders that we, as in Thomas Insel and his colleagues, believe that mental disorders are real. But there's no reality. These are just constructs. There's no reality to schizophrenia or depression. Let that sink in for a moment. From one of the most powerful and influential psychiatrists globally over the past 30 to 40 years. Thomas Insel continued, we are so embedded in this culture. We might have to stop using terms like depression and schizophrenia because they are getting in our way, confusing things. So that's Thomas Insel. Dr. Nancy Andreasen, another prominent American psychiatrist over the past 40 years or so. She was involved in the creation of several of the DSMs over the years. Such was her prominence that she was given a special award by President Bill Clinton for her work. Her book, The Broken Brain, was a bestseller, published in 1984, about which the New York Times wrote, valuable to anyone who knows someone afflicted with a mental illness. Dr. Nancy Andreasen wrote an article entitled DSM, the Death of Phenomenology in America, an Example of Unintended Consequences, published in the Schizophrenia Bulletin in 2007, in which she wrote, The goal of the DSM-3, which was published in 1980, widely regarded as the most important and most influential DSMs of all time, was to create a comprehensive system for diagnosing and evaluating psychiatric patients that would be more reliable, more valid, and more consistent with international approaches. So this was the goal of the creators of the DSM-3. She wrote in relation to the creation of the 1980 DSM-3, the contents of which are predominantly continued in the most recent edition of the DSM. She wrote, "Validity has been sacrificed to achieve reliability. DSM diagnoses have given researchers a common nomenclature, but probably the wrong one. Although creating standardized diagnoses that would facilitate research was a major goal, DSM diagnoses are not useful for research because of their lack of validity. Not useful for research." She mentions the term validity twice here. Validity has been sacrificed and lack of validity. She continued, DSM-3 and its successors, the DSM-3 revised, DSM-4, and more recently the DSM-5, published in 2013, became universally and uncritically accepted as the ultimate authority on psychopathology and diagnosis. Psychopathology meaning what's going wrong within the person in relation to the psychiatric diagnosis. She continued, DSM forms the basis for psychiatric teaching to both residents and undergraduates throughout most of the United States. Notice these terms, universally, uncritically accepted as the ultimate authority. And she's right here. This is exactly what happened. Third highly prominent American physician, Dr. Marcia Angell, a prominent American physician for several decades. Okay. Attached to Harvard Medical School, the Department of Social Medicine. Here are just a few aspects of her career. She was editor of the New England Journal of Medicine for 9 years. Then she became executive editor of this journal for 11 years. Then she became editor-in-chief. So she was an editor of this highly prestigious journal, one of the top 3 most prestigious medical journals in the world, the other 2 being the British Medical Journal and the Journal of the American Medical Association, known as JAMA. She was the first woman to be appointed editor-in-chief of this journal. She has for several decades been attached to Harvard Medical School. Awards. She was named one of 25 most influential Americans by Time magazine in 1997. Quite an accolade. She was senior lecturer in social medicine at Harvard Medical School since the year 2000. She has written on many occasions in the New York Review of Books, including this article, Drug Companies and Doctors, A Story of Corruption, from 2009, within which she wrote about the DSM. Given its importance, you might think that the DSM represents the authoritative distillation of a large body of scientific evidence. And you would think that, given the reverence with which the DSM is considered and held worldwide. It is instead the product of a complex of academic politics, personal ambition, ideology, and perhaps most important, the influence of the pharmaceutical industry. What the DSM lacks is evidence. I'll let that sentence sit with you for a moment. In another article in the New York Review of Books entitled The Illusions of Psychiatry, Dr. Marcia Angell wrote in relation to the DSM that the 1980 DSM-3 was almost certainly more, quote-unquote, reliable than the earlier versions. But reliability is not the same thing as validity. Reliability, as I have noted, is used to mean consistency. Validity refers to correctness or soundness, 2 very different things. If nearly all physicians agreed that freckles were a sign of cancer, the diagnosis would be, quote-unquote, reliable, but not valid, because it would just be everybody agreeing on something. So the conclusion would be consistent, but it's not valid because it's just simply wrong. It's incorrect. The problem with the DSM is that in all of its editions, it has simply reflected the opinions of its writers. And in the case of the DSM-3, mainly of Spitzer himself, who has been justly called one of the most influential psychiatrists of the 20th century, because it was his DSM that completely changed perspectives and perceptions of mental health away from psychology towards a biologically oriented perspective, the perspective that remains to this day. Not only did the DSM become the Bible of psychiatry, as we saw earlier, but like the real Bible, it depended a lot on something akin to revelation. There are no citations of scientific studies to support its decisions. That is an astonishing omission, because in all medical publications, whether journal articles or textbooks, statements of facts are supposed to be supported by citations of public scientific studies. As a medical doctor myself, I know this to be true. This has always been an astonishing omission within the DSM, but an understandable one because they have no scientific evidence to support their conclusions, their decisions. They have no verified evidence of any biological abnormalities that confirm the presence of a biological disease. It may be of much interest for a group of experts to get together and offer their opinions, but unless these opinions can be buttressed by evidence, they do not warrant the extraordinary deference shown to the DSM. She is totally correct. In this article, Dr. Marcia Angel continued, referring to an American psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Carlat, and his book, published in 2010, entitled Unhinged, The Trouble with Psychiatry, A Doctor's Revelations About a Profession in Crisis. Quite a striking title, given that he himself is a psychiatrist. She wrote in relation to what Daniel Carlat wrote in his book. His work consists of asking patients a series of questions about their symptoms to see whether they match up with any of the disorders in the DSM. This matching exercise, he writes, then quoting Daniel Carlat, provides the illusion that we understand our patients when all we are doing is assigning them labels. A third prominent doctor, psychiatrist Professor Ivor Brown, author of many books, many articles. He was formerly Professor of Psychiatry at University College Dublin for many years. In his book Music and Madness, Ivor Brown wrote, "The idea that there is a chemically mediated form of depression, which is a so-called illness, quite separate from the sadness and depression which are part of the slings and arrows of ordinary life, is manifest nonsense." He continued, "It was experiences like this, referring to interactions he had with a patient, which taught me how bogus is the concept of clinical depression." Elsewhere, both in this book and in his commentaries elsewhere, Ivor Brown has made it very clear that he's highly suspect about the whole process of diagnosis, particularly as biological brain diseases, that go on a daily basis within psychiatry. A fourth prominent doctor, American psychiatrist Alan Francis. Gary Greenberg, we met him earlier in relation to Thomas Insel, psychotherapist, author, wrote an article entitled Inside the Battle to Define Mental Illness, published in 2010, within which he interviewed Dr. Alan Francis, globally prominent psychiatrist for 30 to 40 years. He was chair of the 1994 DSM-4 task force that created the DSM-4. Gary Greenberg wrote, quoting an interview he had with Alan Francis, "There is no definition of a mental disorder," Alan Francis said. "It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it. These concepts are virtually impossible to define precisely, with bright lines at the boundaries." He's referring here to an important characteristic of medical diseases, which is levels of normal and abnormal are well defined, as are boundaries between one illness and another. For example, there's no way that experienced physicians would mix up Parkinson's disease with multiple sclerosis, even though both are brain disorders, brain diseases, because the boundaries of each are well defined and they do not cross into each other, as happens regularly in relation to the psychiatric diagnoses. Some tweets published by Alan Francis, now of course within X rather than Twitter, from 2016, "Mental disorders are constructs, they're not diseases." From May 2024, "The harmful mislabeling of normal human distress as so-called mental disorder began 54 years ago with the DSM-3, was cynically exploited by Big Pharma." I had to add here, also by psychiatry, GPs, and medical organisations, who very enthusiastically adopted and promoted the notion of mental disorder. 3. Has become a raging contagion with ubiquity of social media. The worst recent offenders, the 2013 DSM-5 and TikTok. I find this quite striking given that Alan Francis himself was the lead psychiatrist overseeing the creation of the 1994 DSM-4. Another tweet, this time from 2004 again. "All diagnoses in psychiatry are purely descriptive. They're just names for symptoms that tend to go together and help predict course and treatment." I would add to this that they're not just names for symptoms, they're actually names for experiences and behaviours that become repackaged as symptoms. None of the psychiatric diagnoses is the slightest bit explanatory. Causes are too complex, too interacting for us to understand. This is an important point. Most authoritative sources present the psychiatric diagnosis as explanatory. They will regularly start sentences with "depression causes," for example. That's inappropriate because depression itself, as he's saying here, it's just a description. It's not an actual entity. It's not an actual thing. I go into that in more detail elsewhere. The second part here, too complex, too interacting for us to understand. From his perspective, that's true. But being a primarily biologically biased psychiatrist, the only way he can look at the experiences and behaviours is from a biological perspective. He doesn't have the psychological training and understanding to come at this from a psychological perspective. Because when we approach understanding the experiences and behaviours that come to be diagnosed as various psychiatric diagnoses, they actually make complete sense and are entirely understandable from a psychologically and trauma-informed perspective. But this perspective is beyond the vast majority of psychiatrists. So what we have is the rather bizarre situation where a manual, the DSM, is held in a glorified state of reverence around the world as the authoritative guide on the diagnosis of mental disorders. And yet, as I have presented to you, this manual has no validity. This is crazy. Of course, the information that I'm presenting to you in this video is not very well known. And this is why those who primarily subscribe to the DSM and push it as the authoritative guide get away with what they get away with. One of the major implications of all of this is that it's high time that the worlds of therapy, of psychology, psychotherapy, counselling, became more involved in the psychiatric diagnoses. Because the psychiatric diagnoses can be far better understood from a trauma-informed and a psychologically informed perspective than from a biological perspective. Because there are no verified biological abnormalities in relation to these psychiatric diagnoses. This is why, for example, drug companies have been progressively moving away from psychiatry over the past 10 or 15, 20 years towards other areas of medicine. Ironically, because there are no biological abnormalities identified with which to work, with which to try to create drugs to work against. So it's high time that the worlds of psychology, psychotherapy, counselling became more involved, more interested in the psychiatric diagnoses, because there's a great deal that these professions can offer. I know this myself from 25 years as an accredited therapist working in this area. Coinciding with an article that I've written for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy's Journal, Healthcare, Counselling and Psychotherapy Journal, on working with people with a psychiatric diagnosis, this article will be published in their October 2025 edition. I'm creating a series of courses on working with people with psychiatric diagnosis. The first course will be on depression, and it will be available in approximately October 2025. If you would like to be updated about when this course becomes available, message me or contact me below this video, and I will make sure that you are updated in relation to when the course becomes available. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.